you can live a life like that. A whole life doing these little things at home, on the street, at work, lifting people up, giving your best to others. You can be learning from them and teaching them. You can spend your whole life like that. But it can also happen that a circumstance arises, I don't know, like a war breaks out, something like that, one of those unpredictable events in history. And in those circumstances, this person with such perfect morals sometimes stops being an everyday hero and can become a great hero. Because then it comes to the surface, those virtues are taken to the maximum power. He might show a strength that no one even suspected he had before. Within his disciplined, orderly, fair, and beautiful life, he suddenly shows something extraordinary, an extraordinary ability to respond to circumstances. And then, from an everyday hero, he has the potential to become a full-fledged hero. If circumstances push him, he has that seed of heroism inside him. The way he faces the small difficulties of life, it does have a touch of heroism. In other words, he has the seed of heroism within him. So, we're going to look at a couple of historical cases I brought. Just two, just to give us an idea that this isn't a fairy tale. We're talking about a real situation. Two men connected to World War II, two quite interesting figures, one of whom even became a saint, which was Friar Maximilian Maria Kolbe. This is a really beautiful story. He was a Franciscan friar. He was killed in 1941 at the Auschwitz concentration camp. But how did Kolbe die? He was a very charismatic figure, a powerful preacher who was arrested by the Nazis and sent to a concentration camp. And I am skipping over a lot of details here. He was a man with a lot of leadership and a great sense of piety, and he gets arrested and sent to a concentration camp. And there, with all the terrible hardships of living in Auschwitz, he tries to keep spirits high, tries to comfort people, tries to ease the pain of those around him. Until at a certain point, there was an escape of 3 prisoners from the Auschwitz camp. And the Nazis, when there was a prisoner escape, they would take prisoners from the concentration camp. They'd arbitrarily pick 10 and put them in a certain area to die of hunger and thirst, basically left to die, as a way to set an example so others wouldn't try to escape. And those Nazis gathered all the prisoners in the yard and started picking the 10 who would be sacrificed. Suddenly, they pick a man who was a Polish sergeant. And this man breaks down in tears, thinking he'd never see his wife again, never see his kids. He had a family and thought he'd never see them again. And then Kolbe sees this sergeant, so distraught over never seeing his family again. He then proceeds to step forward. He goes out of the line, which is a really bold move, and no one can even say why he didn't get shot right there. And he goes up to the Nazi in charge of that operation and asks for his life to be exchanged for that man's life, the one with a family with kids, so he could die in his place. He was a man Kolbe didn't even know. He asks for his life to be exchanged for that man's. And the Nazis agree. This man, this sergeant, is spared. He survives the war and even lives to a pretty old age. And Maximilian Kolbe dies in that cell where they put them, the 10 prisoners. But they say the whole time he was there singing, praying, lifting the spirits of the men. And he, who was a man with very fragile health, suffered from tuberculosis, had constant pneumonia, had weakened health. He was one of the last to die. 2 weeks later, he was still alive and still trying to lift the spirits of the 2 men who were still alive with him. In other words, he didn't want to leave, didn't want to die before comforting even the last man who was with him. He ended up being killed, and his body was burned. Anyway, Maximilian Kolbe was a friar who conducted his religious ceremonies. He had his very specific work. He was dedicated to spreading devotion to Our Lady. He was a character who fulfilled his duties. Everyone admired him, but he was a simple man. A man, let's say, an everyday hero. But in a situation like that, he showed his brilliance. He showed an enormous capacity for compassion, for selflessness, for giving his life so someone else could enjoy theirs. Maximilian Kolbe was canonized by Pope John Paul II, who was also a pretty interesting Polish man. Kolbe was Polish. Anyway, and even the man whose life he saved was still alive at the time of his canonization. He was present at his canonization. He died at quite an old age. It's an example that I find really beautiful, and that's why I wanted to share with you how amazing it is for a human being to be capable of such a moment of greatness. How beautiful it is, the moral strength someone must have to uphold a decision like that. The beauty of character in a man who stands by a decision like that. The other case, which is also a war story, is a bit different, and that's the case of Oskar Schindler. The one from Schindler's List, the movie we watched by Spielberg, that moved us so much. He's a historical hero who really existed. Before he saved the lives of many Jews, he was an absolutely ordinary man, with behavior that was even a bit questionable, let's say. Ambitious, opportunistic, he wanted opportunities to get ahead in life. Not a thing exceptional. But he was a man who had a great beauty within him, which came to the surface at a certain moment. When he saw the way the Nazis, and he was affiliated with the Nazis, actually. When he saw how the Nazis treated the Jews, the massacre they carried out, he felt that pain deeply. He decided to take a very courageous stand. He was a small German industrialist, and he had a factory that made enameled kitchenware, pots, enameled kitchen pieces. And his employees, his 1,000 employees, he did everything he could to keep them from being taken to concentration camps. So he started bribing all the officers who wanted to take his employees to the concentration camp. He spent his entire fortune on bribes, on things to try to negotiate with the Nazi officers so that his men wouldn't be taken. He asked to move his factory to a more distant location, and so he took his men there. He managed to save a total of 1,200 Jews. Using everything he could, he completely ruined all the money he had, his factory, everything he owned. He ended the war absolutely broke, without a single cent. Getting things on the black market, to bribe the Nazi officers, managing to negotiate all sorts of deals. He was detained 3 times for questioning, because the Nazis started to suspect him. In other words, he was running a serious risk of his life, but he held on until the end, and he managed to save 1,200 Jews. He's one of those who in Israel is considered one of the honored among their nation, one to be remembered. One of those who, during such a tough time, worked to preserve the Jews who were so harshly persecuted. Notice that this is an even more curious case because Oskar Schindler, he was just an ordinary man. Even with some flaws, a behavior that was far from exemplary. But faced with a situation of great injustice, he knew how to bring out the beauty that was inside him. The ability for extreme sacrifice and constantly risking his life to save those 1,200 Jewish prisoners. So there's another story I show you so we can see how there's this transition between the everyday hero and the historical hero. The exceptional hero, the one who exposes themselves to great risks for an act of greatness. How there's this transition which is a continuity when the historical opportunity arises when it's needed. An upright man, a man whose moral behavior is beautiful, he doesn't show off, he doesn't seek to be recognized. But if there's an opportunity to do something bigger, there's a good chance you'll have someone who will step up. A person who will be on the front lines to keep benefiting and helping humanity.